Cassandra Lee pointed across the grand ballroom at the man standing alone near the back wall and said, clearly enough that the nearest 4 tables went quiet, that if he could not produce his lanyard, a business card, or the name of a single person in this room willing to vouch for him, then she was going to have security walk him out before the keynote address started. The man said his name was Thomas Briggs and that he had been invited. She said that wasn't what she had asked. He had a leather notebook worn thin at the spine in his inside coat pocket, and enough documented knowledge of what was happening inside NovaPay's so-called culture of innovation to reach 4 boardrooms before the week was out. He said none of that. He looked at her steadily and waited. She took that waiting as confirmation. The Northern Venture Foundation Gala had been held annually for 11 years at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto, and it mattered in the way that events matter when money is genuinely at stake. 240 guests filled the grand ballroom that October evening. Founders, investors, executives, and a small number of people who had been invited because the foundation had decided years ago that a room like this one needed to contain something other than ambition. The chandeliers were original. The beef was Canadian. The $5 million in grant funding up for consideration was real, and everyone in attendance understood exactly why they were there. Thomas Briggs had arrived at 6:40 in the evening, 20 minutes before the doors officially opened. He had driven himself from Oakville in his 2009 Subaru Forester, parked in the public lot on Front Street, and walked in carrying nothing except his coat. He was 59 years old. The suit was good wool, charcoal gray, and it was 8 years old. The shoes were clean. He wore no tie, no pocket square, and nothing about him suggested that he had left a rented office above a dry cleaner on King Street 17 years earlier and walked into a meeting with 3 people and a photocopied business plan, and that by the time he left that building, those 3 people had placed $4.2 million into a company called Arden Health Systems that would, 11 years later, be acquired by an American health technology firm for $1.8 billion. He had been quiet about that. He had been quiet about most things since. Since the sale, Thomas had served on the Northern Venture Foundation's Grant Selection Committee, under a provision that allowed 2 members to sit without public disclosure. Legacy donors who had funded the foundation's operations during its first 3 years, before it had become the kind of institution that could attract attention on its own. He had been there at the beginning, when the gala was held in a function room above a restaurant, and the total available funding was $400,000. He had written the first check himself. He had written 47 more in the years since, and the total of what he had given was not listed anywhere that a search engine could find. His role at this particular gala was specific. He was not there to give a speech or to be introduced. He was there because the selection committee had received a complaint through unofficial channels 3 months earlier, submitted by a former NovaPay employee, specific in its details, consistent across multiple corroborating accounts, and someone had decided to send a person to stand in the middle of it and see what happened. Thomas had agreed without being asked twice. He knew what he was looking for. He had spent 30 years reading rooms, and he understood that the character of an organization was not a soft or unmeasurable thing. It was data. It was always more legible in the unguarded moments than in the prepared ones. The trick was being present for the unguarded moments. And the trick to that was being someone the room had already decided to ignore. By 7 o'clock, the ballroom had reached its full capacity, and Thomas could read the shape of it within 10 minutes of standing near the back wall. There was a gravitational center, and it was not the foundation's chair or the keynote speaker. It was a woman in a deep green dress who moved through the tables the way water finds the lowest point of a room, without apparent effort, without a wrong step, with every conversation ending on her terms. Cassandra Lee was 32 years old, and she had, by any reasonable measure, earned much of what she had. NovaPay had processed $800 million in transactions in its 3rd fiscal year. Her Series B had been oversubscribed. She had been profiled in the Globe and Mail and in Report on Business, and she gave excellent interviews. She spoke fluently about mission and values and building something that lasts. She had built in 4 years a company with 140 employees. She had built something else alongside it that the profiles did not mention, a personal authority that had, gradually and without anyone naming it, become its own institution. At NovaPay, Cassandra's approval was the variable that determined most things. Whom she acknowledged and whom she looked past, whose ideas she picked up and repeated in her own voice, whose errors she noted aloud in front of the full team versus whose she addressed privately. The people around her had learned the calculus and had adjusted accordingly, the way people always adjust to the arithmetic of a room when the cost of miscalculation is high enough. At the gala, this translated into a radius of attention that moved with her. Jordan Vance, her co-founder, laughed a half-second after Cassandra laughed and stopped when she stopped. The investors orbiting her nodded before she finished sentences. A founder from Waterloo waited to be acknowledged for 8 minutes and then quietly backed away from the edge of the group. Thomas watched all of it. Then Cassandra turned and looked at him. She saw a man in a plain gray suit with no lanyard and no name badge, standing alone against the back wall with a glass of water and no conversation. In a room where every person had been curated, vetted, invited, placed, he was the only element that didn't resolve into a known category. She said something to Jordan Vance. Jordan Vance looked over and both of them laughed. Then she crossed the room. "I don't recognize you," she said when she reached him. "Which company are you with?" "I'm here as a guest of the foundation," Thomas said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her evenly. "Thomas Briggs." She looked at the suit, the plain shirt, the absence of any identifying marker. "The guest list for this event is curated. Every person here has a reason to be here." A pause. "What's yours?" "I was invited." "By whom?" He said the foundation had extended the invitation directly. It was true. It told her nothing, and she heard the nothing, and it did not read to her as discretion. It read as evasion. Evasion from a man with no badge and no context meant one thing. He had found a way into a room he had not been chosen to enter. She turned slightly, so the nearest 3 tables could see her face, and she waited until the conversations closest to them had stopped. "I'm going to ask you something in front of everyone here." Because everyone else in this room answered a version of this question to get through that door. Another pause, long enough to let the silence settle. "What have you built? What have you contributed? What is your stake in this room?" The tables went quiet. Then the next ring out. Thomas said nothing. "Nothing," she said, not loudly. She didn't need to be loud. He's got nothing to say. Someone laughed. It was Jordan Vance, and once Jordan laughed, the shape of the thing was established, and others who were uncertain decided that laughter was the safest available response. She turned back to Thomas. Her voice became almost kind, in the way a person's voice becomes almost kind when they are certain of their ground. "This is a room for people who are building things. There's a standard here. Not everyone gets to stand in it." He set his water glass on the ledge beside him. "I understand," he said. That was all. And she had expected more. A flinch, a protest, the spilled explanations of a man who had been caught somewhere he did not belong. What she got was 2 words and a face she could not read, and it produced in her the particular restlessness of a door that should have opened and didn't. So she continued. She stopped a nearby staff member and took a second serving tray and held it out to Thomas without ceremony, and said that if he was going to take up space in this room, he should at least be useful. The staff member stepped back, uncertain. Nobody said anything. Jordan Vance laughed first, and a table of investors followed, and the sound moved outward across the ballroom in the way laughter moves. When people are relieved, it isn't pointed in their direction. Thomas took the tray. He held it level in both hands and stood in his gray suit, while Cassandra walked a slow circle around him and told the room, in the voice she had perfected for keynote stages, that this was what happened when standards slipped. She had built something real, she said. The people in this room had built something real. Not everyone understood what that cost. She stopped in front of him and looked at the tray. "Ask him what he's built," she said to the room. "Go ahead, ask him anything." Nobody asked. 200 people stood in a chandelier-lit ballroom and found interesting things to look at in their wine glasses, and Thomas held the tray and looked back at all of them, and he kept looking, and he was doing, during those 3.5 minutes, precisely what he had come to do. He was not counting the humiliation, he was counting the room. The man near the center pillar, who shook his head almost imperceptibly and then stopped when the woman beside him put a hand on his arm. The foundation's communications director, standing with her back half-turned, the specific half-turn of a person who has decided not to be on record as having witnessed what they are witnessing. The founder from Waterloo, Calvin Okoro, the name on his lanyard said, who had been dismissed from Cassandra's orbit an hour earlier, and who now watched from across the room with the expression of someone recognizing something that had already happened to them. Thomas memorized all of it. He held the tray and he memorized the room. After 3.5 minutes, Cassandra took the tray back because she had run through every available escalation, and the one after this would not look like discipline. She handed it to the staff member and said quietly, to Jordan Vance, that someone should find out who had let him in and make sure it didn't happen again before the inspection team showed up tomorrow. Thomas returned to the wall. He took out the leather notebook and wrote for approximately 45 seconds. He capped the pen and put the notebook away. A woman near the room's side door had watched him do it. Her name was Dorothy Huang, and she had arrived from Pearson Airport 20 minutes earlier and had positioned herself at the back long enough to see most of what had just happened. She was 61 years old, the chair of the Northern Venture Foundation's board of directors, a position she had held for 6 years. She had built and sold a logistics company in British Columbia that had made her, by the time she stepped away from it, one of the most respected operators in the country. She had watched Thomas hold the tray, and she had watched the room while he held it. And she had not moved because Thomas had given her no signal to, and she had known him long enough to understand that when he didn't signal, there was a reason. But she had seen what she needed to see. The selection committee met in closed session the following morning on the 14th floor of the Foundation's Bay Street offices. There were 6 members. Thomas had been up since 5 and had spent 2 hours writing at the desk in his hotel room. What he had produced was not a summary of how he had felt holding a serving tray in front of 200 people. It was a precise account of 22 observable behaviors across 3 hours, with names, timestamps, and a column of short notations indicating which behaviors were isolated incidents and which were part of a pattern. Dorothy opened the meeting. She said what the committee had witnessed and what the committee had to decide. She did not narrate the ballroom events. Thomas was present, and what the others had heard through informal channels was sufficient to make narration unnecessary. Robert Atchison sat at the far end of the table. He was 64 years old, and he had built and sold 3 technology companies in 30 years. He had written the check that funded NovaPay's seed round, and he had mentored Cassandra Lee for the first 18 months of the company's existence. He had spoken of her publicly, on more than one occasion, as one of the most genuinely talented operators he had encountered in his career. He looked at the table and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "I want to see the original complaint." Thomas passed the printed document across without comment. Robert read it. He read it twice. He set it face down and did not turn it over again. "She came to me 3 months ago," he said. "She told me it was from someone let go for cause. I didn't ask to see the file." Thomas said that part was true. The person had been let go. Robert looked at him. "The cause was insubordination," Thomas said. "The insubordination was that she told Cassandra, in a team meeting, that a product decision was going to create compliance problems." He paused. The compliance problems materialized 5 months later. They cost NovaPay $340,000 in regulatory fines and 4 weeks of remediation. The woman who had flagged it was not there to see it. No one at the table said anything. The committee reviewed the application for 2.5 hours. They reviewed financials and projections and character references, and they reviewed the pattern of conduct Thomas had documented across 3 months of preparation and 1 evening's observation. They discussed the line between a demanding culture and a harmful one, and they discussed what a grant from the Northern Venture Foundation was intended to signal to the broader ecosystem, beyond the recipient, beyond the single funding cycle. Susan Nakamura noted that the committee's charter gave it full discretion and required no explanation to any applicant. Thomas said he would like to give one anyway. Cassandra arrived at the Foundation's offices the following morning at 9 o'clock, and the man who met her in the reception area was not a staff member she recognized. He led her to the conference room on the 14th floor and sat across the table and told her, without ceremony, that NovaPay's application had not been selected for funding in this cycle. She was quiet then. On what basis? He told her about the complaint and about the 22 documented behaviors, and about what had been observed across one evening in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York. He told her the determination was not that NovaPay had done something unlawful or that she lacked talent. Neither of those things was true. The determination was that the culture she had built was not the kind the foundation could, in good conscience, position at the center of the ecosystem it was responsible for shaping. She sat across from him, and he could see the moment she placed him. The suit, the wall, the tray, and he could see the calculation behind her eyes, the search for a version of events that led somewhere else. "You could have said something," she said finally, "last night. One sentence and none of that would have happened." "One sentence would have ended it for me," Thomas said. "It wouldn't have ended it for anyone else." She looked at him. "There were 200 people in that room," he said. "Founders, investors, board members. 200 people watched a man handed a serving tray by someone with no authority to give him orders, and not one of them said a word. Not one. He let that sit. That's not a coincidence. That's a culture. And it didn't begin that evening." He looked at her steadily. "People learn what a room tolerates. Someone taught them." She said nothing for a long time. Then, "Robert, did he?" "Robert Atchison submitted a written statement to the committee this morning," Thomas said, "on his own initiative, before he was asked." He slid a single printed page across the table. She read it. What Robert had written was brief and precise. He said he had failed to examine a complaint when it had been placed in his hands 3 months earlier, and that failure was his own. He said that the talent he had observed in Cassandra Lee over 4 years was not in question. What was in question was something he had neglected to ask about often enough. Not a question about revenue or product or market timing, but a question about what happened to the people who were in the room when the decisions were made, and whether they were still in the room the following quarter. Cassandra set the page down. "I didn't think of it as," she started and stopped. "No," Thomas said. His voice was not unkind. "That's precisely it. It didn't feel like a choice. It felt like administration." She looked at the table. "The woman who raised the compliance issue," he said. "Her name is in the committee's file. She has been consulting independently for 8 months. She is very good at what she does." A pause. "Someone with standing should tell her that, officially, before she stops believing it." Cassandra looked up at him. He stood and reached for his coat. "The people at NovaPay have followed your direction for 4 years," he said. "Every deadline, every standard, every pivot. That's execution, and you are genuinely excellent at it." He looked at her once more. Not one of those 200 people spoke up last night when it cost them almost nothing to do it. You should think carefully about what that tells you about the room you built, and whether the next 4 years produce the same room or a different one. He left. She sat in the conference room for a long while and then went out into the corridor and did not take the elevator. She walked down 11 flights of stairs to the lobby because she needed the time. The foundation announced its grant recipients 3 weeks later. Alongside the announcement, the selection committee submitted a procedural recommendation. Thomas had drafted it. Dorothy had refined it, that the foundation's evaluation process be expanded to include a culture assessment component for all finalists. Not a checklist or a survey, but a structured observation conducted by a representative who was not identified in advance as part of the selection process. The recommendation was adopted. It appeared in a procedural update sent to the foundation's membership, 3 paragraphs below a change to the application deadline, and most people read past it without pausing. The people who paused were the ones who had been waiting for it. Jordan Vance resigned as co-founder of NovaPay 6 weeks later. The announcement cited personal reasons, and no one who had been standing in that ballroom believed it was only that. Calvin Okoro, the founder from Waterloo who had waited 8 minutes at the edge of a conversation that never opened for him, submitted an application to the foundation's next cycle. His company had been doing patient, careful work in agricultural logistics for 3 years. His team had a turnover rate of 6% in an industry where 40 was considered acceptable. He was selected in April. Thomas was not at the announcement dinner. He had driven back to Oakville the morning after the committee meeting, and the forester was in the driveway by noon. He spent the afternoon in the garden, which needed cutting back before the frost came. Dorothy called him in March, before the next cycle began, and said the board wished to acknowledge him publicly in the annual report, not at a gala, just formally, with his name attached to the foundation's history. He said he would prefer she didn't. She said she knew he would say that. He said, "The work doesn't need my name on it to be real." She was quiet for a moment, then no, but the people who come after might need to know it's possible. He said he would think about it. He kept the notebook. He had filled 4 of them in 11 years on the committee, and this one still had pages remaining. He opened it the following morning at the kitchen table with his coffee, and the last entry, the 45 seconds he had written standing at the back of the grand ballroom while 200 people looked at their shoes, was still there between 2 pages, 22 names and behaviors, and beneath them, a single line he had added afterward. A room reflects what it has been taught to tolerate. He turned to the next page. It was blank. 6 months later, he was driving through the city on other business and passed the foundation's Bay Street offices without stopping. But he slowed at the corner because a young woman was standing at the main entrance talking on her phone in the way people talk when something has genuinely gone well. Shoulders down, one hand moving, laughing because something was actually funny. He didn't know her. He drove on. Some rooms take years to change. The change, when it comes, doesn't announce itself. It shows up in the ease of a conversation that would have been careful 12 months earlier. In the simple fact that a person speaks plainly in a meeting and is not standing in the parking lot afterward wondering what it cost them. In the posture of someone at a door, head up walking through it. That is the whole of it sometimes. What a person builds with power is visible while they hold it. What they build with character is what remains when the room is empty, and no one remembers whose name was on the door.